Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. My name is Jennifer Burnett, and I'm the Program Manager for Fiscal and Economic Policy here at the Council of State Governments. First off, we are happy to take any questions you might have of our presenters. Just pull up your chat box in the GoToWebinar box on your screen and type in any question you may have. We'll hold those questions until the end of the webinar, and then I will ask those questions of our presenters in the order that they were received. I'd like to start off our webinar today by introducing our first presenter and our moderator, Dr. Gary VanLandingham. Gary is the director of the Results First project, a joint initiative of the Pew Charitable Trusts and the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, a program that will be the focus of our webinar today. Before joining Pew in January 2011, Gary served for 7 years as director of the Office of Program Policy Analysis and Government Accountability in Florida, the legislature's Policy, Research, and Evaluation arm. He has over 30 years of experience conducting and leading policy studies at the state and local government levels. Now I'll turn it over to Gary to start us off. Gary?
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for this opportunity to share with you the Results First initiative, which is a project which a growing number of states are joining to help provide better information to policymakers in both the executive and legislative branches to help tackle some of the toughest problems that are before states today. And we all recognize the challenge that states have faced in recent years. Since the start of the Great Recession, states have dealt with almost $500 billion worth of budget cuts, an unimaginably huge number when you consider the fact that many state budgets are only a few $billion. And over that time period, we've seen states struggling with the fundamental question of, if we've got to deal with revenue shortfalls, what is the best way of doing so that preserves our most critical programs while cutting those programs which are giving relatively less benefits for our citizens. Next slide, please. And we recognize that policymakers everywhere want to do the right thing. We want to preserve the dollars that are available for the programs that produce the biggest bang for the buck. But far too often we're seeing that states and local governments as well are really doing something else entirely. What they are doing is resorting to round after round of across-the-board budget cuts. And they do that in a way that preserves the ineffective programs, though they're being funded at a lower level, but also can hamstring the most effective programs and hinder our ability to provide the public services that are necessary to help our states deal with the challenges of the 21st century. Next slide, please. And a fundamental reason why states do that and leaders do that is simply there hasn't been a lot of information available on what our best choices are. So when policymakers sit around the table and say, well, we need to cut programs that are relatively ineffective and we need to continue to fund our most effective programs, there's usually a pregnant pause and someone says, well, which programs are those? Because states, unfortunately, don't have some fairly critical information that ideally they would have. For example, states frequently don't know what programs exist. Programs get created, they are funded, they are given to agencies with implementing legislation or proviso legislation to guide their operation. And then after that, they typically vanish from sight. And that is because of the way that governments manage the appropriation process. Monies are not appropriated by program. Typically what happens is that money is appropriated by agency or by line items, such as for salaries, expenses, and the like. What that means is that government simply doesn't have a comprehensive list of all the programs that are out there that are being administered by the agencies throughout the enterprise of government. Governments also don't know how much each of those programs cost because, again, our accounting systems do not track information by program. We track it by organization and by line items, such as salaries. So we don't know what programs we're operating. We don't know how much they cost. And we also typically don't have a lot of information on what those programs are accomplishing. While many states are implementing performance budgeting or performance measurement systems, what we see is that the types of information being reported to policymakers is typically focused more on process issues such as the number of people being served rather than the outcomes. So we don't have information on whether reading programs are producing kids who read, or whether our job training programs are resulting in people who are gaining long-term employment at good salaries. We simply don't have a lot of information on what our programs are accomplishing, and even if agencies are starting to report that information, it's very difficult to compare those measures. It's difficult for policymakers to take a look at performance measures such as the number of people in a job training program or smoking cessation rates 3 months after people have finished a smoking program, or the percent of lane miles in a state that are rated A or better for highway smoothness, and to say, well, which of these really represent the best way of investing our tax dollars? There's no way of comparing the information among programs to say, what are our most effective programs? So consequently, you can understand why governments make across-the-board cuts. If policymakers don't have the information necessary to make that information, they cut across the board and hope that agencies can figure it out. But unfortunately, agencies typically lack the same type of information as well. So there's just a huge information vacuum that's necessary to help policymakers make better choices. The Results First initiative addresses these challenges and allows states to make much more informed decisions based on high-quality evidence that's available to us now nationally about which programs are the most effective and which ones can represent the best bang for the buck for our citizens. Next slide, please. And Results First is based on a fairly straightforward three-step process. First, we recognize that there is a lot of information out there about programs. Over the last 40 years, tens of thousands of program evaluations have been done that have looked at a large number of programs. Many programs have been evaluated many times across the states using very strong research designs. Now, the challenge for policymakers is when they want to do something about a problem such as how can we reduce crime, their staff doesn't have the time to go through those tens of thousands of evaluations to say, here's what we know about how effective different programs are likely to be. Well, to solve that problem, our research partners at this point have gone through almost 30,000 evaluations, identifying the strongest research that we have to identify what we know about how programs are likely to have effects on the ground. And the good news is we know a lot about a lot of programs nationally. And what Results First does is it brings that information to states and makes it actionable. So if 50 studies have been done on drug courts, for example, and those 50 studies in different jurisdictions have said drug courts in our jurisdiction, they all have about the same outcomes if implemented well. Well, that is a good level for prediction of how effective that program is likely to be if implemented in any state. And we're able to bring that information to states and help that information be made available to policymakers. The second thing we do is we say that it's important to know that drug courts can reduce crime, but it's more important to know what would happen if we did a drug court based in our state, based on our state's own population characteristics, the facts on the ground. How many people would this program serve? What impact would it have on the state's crime rate? How many crimes would be avoided? What's the value of that intervention for our citizens? And the third thing that we do is we look at the cost of implementing each of those programs, and we're able to put a dollar value on the benefits that they would be achieved, again, based on that research, based on the facts on the ground in a state, and allows us to do a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis on programs. In each program, we look at it using the same methodology, the same assumptions, and this allows us to do, for the first time, an apples-to-apples comparison on the effectiveness of programs across the sphere of government using the same assumptions, the same methodologies, all based on what return on investment would this program achieve for our citizens if we did it in our jurisdiction. Next slide, please. And for example, to give you an idea what this looks like in criminal justice. In criminal justice, we want to look at two primary factors of programs. First is, what impact would they have for taxpayers? How much would it cost to implement this program, and what would the benefits be worth to us as taxpayers? And second, we want to look at the societal cost, because when we're dealing with crime, we care not only about the financial cost of crime, we care about the societal cost, because we want to reduce and avoid victimizations. So we want to see if we can identify programs that are both effective to us in terms of reducing crime, but are also cost effective to us in representing a good way of spending the taxpayer dollars. Next slide. And to give you an idea of how this process works, this is based on data that was reported by Washington State, and Washington State, like many states, was grappling with juvenile crime back in the 1990s, when there was a lot of concern about juvenile crime. And when we're thinking about juvenile crime, typically we react to juveniles who are starting to get into problems by providing them a series of services, but if they continue to get into trouble, typically we send them off to a residential commitment bed, meaning that we take them out of their community and we send them off into providing them intensive services, educational services, drug treatment programs if necessary, counseling services to help them get off the path of committing crime and to hopefully turn them into good citizens. When that process is done, then we release them back into the community. Well, many states do that and send the children off to residential commitment beds. But there's two challenges in doing that. First, it's very expensive for taxpayers. The cost of a residential commitment bed for states is typically over $80,000 a year for every child we send off. In some states, it's much higher than that. The second problem is that, as you see from this graph, it's also not a particularly effective way of dealing with juvenile crime. As you see in Washington State, if you release people from juvenile detention residential commitment beds, usually within about a year, over half of the kids are back into the system. If you go out 4 or 5 years, over 60% of the children will be back into the system. The program simply hasn't been that effective in helping us deal with crime. So what's an alternative? Functional family therapy is a program that many states are experimenting with, and it's based on the theory that rather than sending children away from their home and away from their home society, we will deal with them in their home, in their community, and provide services not only to the child, but also to their family. Recognizing that if the children are going to be returned to the community, we have to help prepare them to deal with the situation that they're facing, and also recognizing that if we help the family deal with the challenges that it may be facing, which may be contributing to juvenile delinquency, then we can equip their parents to be better parents, and that means that we don't have to be parents of the children as taxpayers. So is this an effective program? Well, in Washington State did a comprehensive analysis of functional family therapy and found that the program, all the research showed that on average, functional family therapy reduces crime by about 22% compared to sending kids off to residential commitment beds. So the effect of this program is by 22%. As we see, there's still a recidivism curve. Many of the children will over time commit new crimes, but they do so at a substantially lower rate than they would have if we would have sent them off to residential commitment beds. So what Results First ask is, what's it cost to reduce to reduce crime by that 22%, and what's it worth to us if we're able to do that? And let's see what the results were in Washington State for this. Next slide. So in Washington State, it cost around $3,200 for every juvenile who's served in functional family therapy. And when you compare that against the cost of sending the child to a residential commitment bed, about $80,000, we can see immediately that it's much more cost effective. The question is it more effective to us as taxpayers and as society? So from the next slide, looking at the benefits, the research shows that functional family therapy, by reducing crime by an average of 22%, will produce about $32,000 in benefits to the citizens of Washington State, because it reduces taxpayer costs when kids no longer come back into the system, and because the kids are less likely to commit crime, there is less victimization that occurs in the state. Also, the research shows that children who are served in functional family therapy are much more likely to continue in school and are much more likely to graduate from high school than kids who were sent off to residential commitment beds, because they're able to stay in their own school. So we know that children who graduate from high school have much better outcomes in terms of employment and wages than kids who are unsuccessful in completing high school. So on average, it's about $5,600 in benefits that we would recognize on the basis of the children and taxpayers as an outcome of functional family therapy. Also, children who go through this program tend to have less public costs for health care because two reasons. Because they have better outcomes for employment, they are able to gain private access to health insurance, so we don't have to provide public health care for them, and also because they're less likely to go out and get in trouble than they don't get into scrapes that cause them to go to emergency rooms, and we have lower health care costs for them. So total benefits overall are about $38,000, and these are reduced to present values because some of these benefits occur over time. So compared to the $3,000 in cost of this program, we see that it does have a very high return on investment. Next slide, please. So about a net of $34,000 for taxpayers and society for Washington State for every child who would be served to this program. Now we recognize that not all children who go through this program will in fact avoid crime. But because that 22% reduction means that there are substantially fewer crimes being committed, on average, even though many of the children may still commit some crime, most of them will not, we're able to have a net benefit of about $34,000 for taxpayers, or about $11 being returned for every dollar that would be invested in the program. So a very high return on investment for this program. Next slide. So what we're able to do in Results First is to do the same type of analysis on a portfolio of programs and be able to provide policymakers what we call a consumer reports guide to policy. Because we see that there are many alternatives available for policymakers, everything from drug sentencing for adult offenders and work release to a variety of programs for juveniles. Next slide, please. And these programs have very different costs. Some of them are relatively costly. Drug courts for juveniles cost about $3,000 for every child that are in there. And some are very inexpensive. Scared Straight programs only cost $63. So if this is the only information a policymaker had, and this is about the only information that is available in most states, they might say, we don't have a lot of money to spend. Maybe we should spend it on Scared Straight because we will be able to serve more people through this program. Well, we could do that, but as we see, when we're able to predict the benefits of these programs, it produces very different outcomes for policymakers. Next slide, please. Because the Results First approach, which is again using the research to estimate the impact of programs on the ground and to put a dollar value on that, shows that the cost of programs are not really well related to the benefits that they would achieve. Some programs are simply much more effective than others in solving the problems they were designed to deal with. So we see that aggression replacement training for juveniles has a huge return on investment, over $66,000 in benefits for every child served. And Scared Straight, which looked good from a perspective of only looking at cost, we look at the benefits of those programs, we see that it is a terrible investment for taxpayers, because research has shown that children who go through that program are more likely to commit crime rather than less likely to commit crime. So it simply is a bad investment for any state. Washington State realized that and stopped funding this program. Next slide, please. When we're able to put all this information together and present a cost-benefit ratio for each program, we see that some things represent really best buys for states. Aggression replacement training for juveniles, cognitive behavioral therapy for adult offenders in Washington State were very much best buys. And the legislature has used this information to shift money away from programs which produced, in some case, a negative cost-benefit ratio or a low cost-benefit ratio to the programs that produce better bangs for the buck. And by doing so, have been able to produce some dramatic gains for their citizens. Next slide, please. This approach has been used for about 15 years in Washington State. It was developed by a research center for the legislature called the Washington State Institute for Public Policy. And the legislature, over this time period, has been using this approach to scrutinize its investment choices and to use this information as it's building its budget. And by doing that, by moving money away from programs that this systematic approach has shown to be relatively bad investments to those programs which the results show are better outcome, can produce better outcomes for citizens, a better bang for the buck, they've been able to produce some substantial gains. Next slide, please. For example, over this time period, they've been able to reduce their crime rate substantially to a level substantially below the national average. And they're avoiding about $1.3 billion per budget cycle because they've been able to close facilities and avoid building new facilities simply because that they weren't necessary. Not because they were spending more money to fight crime, but because they were spending the money that they were spending in a much more comprehensive and much better way. Next slide, please. The Pew-MacArthur Results First initiative is bringing this approach to other states to replicate the process that Washington State's been using and hopefully over time to replicate that success. As you see, we're working in 14 states across the country, and this includes both very large states and small rural states, red states and blue states, because this is an approach that really communicates across the political divide, because it's not about spending more money or less money, it's about spending money better, to identify through proven research approach what are the most effective ways of investing taxpayer dollars to produce the best return for our citizens, and doing so in a way that recognizes we know much more about what works now than we've ever had before, and we can make this information available to policymakers and to help them use taxpayer dollars to achieve the best outcomes for our citizens. Next slide, please. Results First provides a number of services to states to help them go down this path. We provide the software which this cost-benefit analysis is housed on. We train staff in the approach and provide technical assistance as they use this approach to gain the information necessary to be able to do this type of analysis based on the situation in the ground. We also help policymakers use this information because our goal is to not only get this approach operational in a state, but also to make it live and something that policymakers understand and are able and willing to use in the budget process and the policy process. Next slide, please. We are also creating a community of practice among the 14 states because each state is doing some really interesting work with this model. And we're able to identify lessons learned by each state and to use this to build the strength of the overall process moving forward. We're also continuing to expand and update the model into more and more policy areas over time and to capture the information that we are gathering from our state partners to use that to make the model much more useful and user-friendly to states over time. Next slide, please. And the important thing and the takeaway is that all of our services are free of charge. All of our activities are funded by the Pew and MacArthur boards, so there is no licensing fee. There is no cost to states for doing this other than the staff time necessary to collect the information and to get the model operational. That is not a heavy lift for states. In the states that we're working with, typically it's a group of 2 or 3 analysts who are working on this on a part-time basis, and they're doing this over a period of 6 months to a year. So this is something that we are very interested in bringing to states. We are interested in expanding the number of states we're working in because we feel that this is a way that can really help states make much more informed choices for their citizens and to do so in a way that recognizes the power of evidence and makes that evidence part of the overall process. Next slide, please. What we'd like to do now is to turn this over to representatives of 3 of the states that we're working in. And these states are in different stages of Results First. First, Brian Dickerson from Mississippi will talk about his state's experience in Results First, and Mississippi joined Results First only a couple of months ago. Next, we'll turn it over to Mike Coelho in Massachusetts, which has been underway for a little bit more than a year, and that'll be followed by Charles Sallee of New Mexico, who has done the most with Results First out of this group of states, and will share some of the exciting work that's being done in that state. So first, let me turn it over to Brian Dickerson of the state of Mississippi.
Thank you, Gary. Good afternoon, and again, my name is Brian Dickerson. I'm an evaluator with the Legislative Peer Committee located in Jackson, Mississippi. Also with me is Dr. Max Arnder, who is our executive director, and Mr. Brian Pew, who is a budget analyst with the Legislative Budget Office of Mississippi. Next slide, please. I first want to provide a little background on who I work for and our relationship to the Mississippi Legislature. PEER is a legislative committee focused on program evaluation, expenditure review, and short-term legislative assistance to any senator or representative who may require it. We cover everything from expenditure review to performance audits to investigations. Generally, any agency that receives state funds is under our purview. Ultimately, our larger projects result in recommendations to the legislature, focusing on specific changes to state law that may be required after an audit, or to agencies focusing on changes to policies or procedures. The cost-benefit model is housed at PEER, and PEER is handling the operation of it, along with running any reports that will produce, collecting and integrating data into it, and performing analysis on it with help from both the Legislative Budget Office and the Results First team. Next slide, please. We are still working on data collection with the Department of Corrections and have recently expanded from collecting data only on adults to juvenile offenders as well. We have also begun building a program inventory of all types and programs listed under the Department of Education to compare against those evidence-based programs identified in the Results First model. Though we are still in the data collection portion of the corrections and education areas and have not used the model to inform policy or budgetary decisions yet, we have set an early fall 2013 deadline to provide an overview of the model, data findings on evidence-based programs or the lack thereof, cost findings such as cost per unit and cost per program, and what data will be available in the coming months leading up to the legislative session in 2014. Next slide, please. Discussion with legislatures and agency staff who were present at a recent roundtable presentation of the model indicate that at a minimum, Results First has proven that Mississippi could benefit from the program inventory portion alone of the CBA model, meaning they are interested in seeing the number of true programs being run by their agency and the particular result of those programs, and conversely which ones they are not tracking results for, and which of those programs are evidence-based versus conventional wisdom or best practice modalities. It will also help to continuously wedge in the need for evidence-based programs and tracking expenditures on a program basis rather than by line item budgeting. Mississippi has been fortunate thus far in capturing data because our main inmate populations are housed under a centralized authority with a computer system tracking generally every aspect of their incarceration period, helping us build our recidivism data set more quickly than we anticipated. However, we do have other areas of the model that aren't centralized that we are expanding to at the local and county level, such as sheriff's and court data. The model so far has been resource intensive on the front end for both PEER and the Legislative Budget Office and the Department of Corrections, but we believe the intensity will decrease once the model data begins to roll in and the collection process becomes more clearly understood and hopefully automated to some extent. Next slide, please. Ultimately, PEER is responsible for providing data that will inform policymakers, but the budgeting process itself and the extent to which this data is used will largely depend on the degree to which our legislators, and specifically our appropriations committees, interpret this data and allocate funds based on model projections. We have not laid out a method for integrating the Results First data with our budgeting process yet. Once we have the model fully functioning and producing usable data, we will probably invite policymakers, agency staff, and other stakeholders for a roundtable meeting on the best way to move forward with this data. We envision this will take into consideration projected agency needs versus the budget environment for the next fiscal year, and then comparing that with model projections for needs, including new program staffing, reallocation of funds towards evidence-based programs, and incorporation of a revitalized performance-based budgeting process, which we believe will provide additional dividends. Ultimately, our short-term goal is to keep the Appropriations Committee and other relevant committees interested in the model for the next few months until we can get a report out to them in the fall, meaning we keep them up to date on where we are, our realistic deadlines for giving them usable data, and breaking down analysis so they can understand the findings of the report without having a technical understanding of the model itself. That concludes my section of the presentation, and I believe we are holding questions until the end, so I will let Gary introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Brian. Our next speaker will be Michael Coelho, who's Assistant Secretary for Policy and Planning with the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security in Massachusetts. Michael.
Great, thanks, Gary. So just a little bit about where we are in Massachusetts. I'm at the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security. We oversee the Department of Corrections and Parole. We have a fractured system here in Massachusetts, so it takes a little bit more work to get the data together for the model. But I'll walk you through some of the terrific benefits of the work we've done over the last year and change. If I can go to the next slide. So as Gary touched on briefly, the benefits are clear in terms of the kind of information we provide to policymakers. The act of gathering the data itself has been a terrific benefit to Massachusetts because of our fractured system. We have probation over in judiciary. The houses of correction, which deal with sentence population of less than 2 years, is run by 12 different elected sheriffs. And so prior to Pew Results First in the work we need to do to understand our outcomes and our recidivism rates, the most comprehensive analysis done of recidivism was in 2000, and it was only a sample of different populations. In the last year, our team of researchers across all the different systems, across judiciary and the executive branch and the houses of correction run by the sheriffs, have looked at over 41,000 records. Basically, everybody discharged from the criminal justice agency in 2005. And that's produced a very rich data set that has a lot of important implications outside of just the results first model. And so how we use that data going forward is a big question. It also includes probation data, which is something we had not had before in terms of analyzing recidivism here in Massachusetts. So a number of firsts just in the act of building a data set for the model that we've accomplished in the last year. The next slide. In addition to the output that's occurred, this rich data set of 41,000 records, their recidivism patterns, the demographic information, their age that we want to use going forward, in trying to pull this together across the different entities and the different systems, we realize we have to refine our ability and standardize our ability to do this kind of analysis, because once you see it, you're going to want to see it all the time. And so we are beginning a process to create a data storage warehouse where we can stage data from all the different systems and then try to build a platform to access that information for both researchers and budget writers and policymakers. And so we had a full-day planning session with a vendor that manages our system now to figure out how to move forward on this kind of model. And so we're very excited about where that might take us as a state in terms of understanding our outcomes here in Massachusetts. Next slide. The work that's being done in Results First as an organizing principle has led to a number of important benefits. Again, prior to the actual model being completed, we're on track here in Massachusetts after a year to do a version of the model focused on DOC inmates, Department of Correction, adult offenders here. We have outcome data. We have the marginal cost data for the activities associated with incarceration, as well as the programmatic inventory. But the discussions that this work and understanding and the community of folks that have come together to participate in this work have really led to a number of important benefits. For example, here in Massachusetts, discussions have begun with judiciary and probation, as well as with the executive branch and the houses of correction run by the sheriffs, to better utilize a resource here in Massachusetts called the Office of Community Corrections. It's strictly a probation resource now. It's underutilized, and we're looking to see if it's possible for inmates within the Department of Correction who may be stepping down within 6 months of release, as well as inmates at the houses of correction. Can we utilize the community corrections resource? It delivers evidence-based programming, which is terrific and strong, and we're hoping to see if our populations can access it. In addition, the Secretaries of Public Safety, Mary Beth Heffernan and her successor, Andrea Cabral, have set aside $5.2 million in burn discretionary funding to pilot evidence-based programs here in Massachusetts across these systems. So to pilot diversion programs, to pilot some of the reentry programming that utilizes therapeutic communities or common behavioral therapy. Some of the best practices highlighted within the Pew model, we're looking to set up funding to further expand that work here in Massachusetts and to hire an evaluator to ensure full fidelity to those evidence-based practices, so we can come back to the legislature and demonstrate, in a very concrete way that Massachusetts can execute evidence-based programming, and then when we do it right in this fidelity, we produce much better outcomes. In addition, the program inventory that we've completed as part of the Pew work within the Department of Correction here in Massachusetts has accelerated our work to tie analysis of program participation behind the wall with the outcomes that are achieved once they're released from the Department of Correction. For example, we have something here in Massachusetts called the Correctional Recovery Academy. It's considered a therapeutic community. And so our most recent cohort analysis, we looked at the 2008 release cohort through the end of 2011, and we're tying some of their recidivism analysis to their participation within that therapeutic community. And so it's accelerating some of the work we need to do, not just to track what's happening once they leave, but to tie it back to what occurred behind the wall while they were incarcerated here with the state. Next slide. Another outstanding benefit is that we are looking to, there's interest in other state agencies and other secretaries and policy areas. Pew Results First will be coming here in Massachusetts to present the model's application within early childhood welfare as well as within social services. We've used some of the Results First data, some of the program inventory assessment that we've completed to argue for more investment in programming and give them details about the wait lists for evidence-based programming that we offer, the limited amount that we do. And we have a better understanding of the wait lists and the capacity and how many people are eligible, how many people are receiving that programming. So last week during the Senate budget debate on the Department of Correction appropriation, a lot of the data that we gathered for the Results First model we utilized for talking points for different representatives and senators looking to advocate on behalf of reentry-based programming. So, there's a number of benefits that have been articulated by Gary and the other states. I really wanted to focus on as an organizing principle and the benefits that accrue before the model is even completed. So that's sort of what I wanted to offer to the panel today. I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Michael. Now we're going to go to the great state of New Mexico and Charles Sallee to talk about New Mexico's experience with the Results First approach. Charles.
Good afternoon. Again, my name is Charles Sallee, and I'm the Deputy Director at the Legislative Finance Committee. LFC started working with the Results First in 2012 after our committee was asking for more and better comparative information on which programs work best and what that would mean for New Mexico. Next slide. The LFC is the legislature's permanent joint budget committee. It has 16 members, 8 from the House, 8 from the Senate. They're proportionate to political affiliation, and they're staffed by a team of nonpartisan staff. Our LFC staff assists the committee to develop a full budget recommendation for all of state government, public schools, and higher education for consideration by the full legislature. The New Mexico legislature considers both the LFC budget proposal as well as a separate one from the governor, which is somewhat unique. Budget staff also assists the committee with its oversight during the interim and conducts policy analysis. We have a team of program evaluators within LFC that conduct in-depth accountability work. This is the unit that I oversee. We also have a team of economists that work on revenue estimates and tracking. Given the LFC's responsibilities, you can see why this type of cost-benefit analysis is ideal to be housed at our agency. Next slide. So far, we've used just one of my program evaluators working on a very limited part-time basis to load the data necessary into the model, and we've had great progress in working with our executive branch agencies to get this information up and running. As you can see, that we have the model and are able to use it in multiple areas, including adult and juvenile crime, all the way into substance abuse. We intend to refresh the data going forward once a year, and are planning on finishing out loading information on mental health. We still do have a number of areas where we're still inventorying which programs executive agencies are using. Next slide. So far, we've been using Results First in our program evaluation work primarily. We've used the cost-benefit information in a couple of reports we've issued over the past year, including a report on our adult prison and parole system. New Mexico, for example, was using a generally cost-beneficial drug treatment program, a therapeutic community, but we found during the course of our evaluation that the department was struggling with implementation of the program as it was designed. As a result, we weren't getting the results you would otherwise expect. After our report, the department disbanded that particular program and is implementing a different drug treatment model, which we will be able to track expected versus actual results over time. We also incorporated information from the model to recommend using Medicaid to help finance intensive home visiting services for pregnant women and infants. We documented the cost of poor outcomes for many low-income children in the state and the benefits that could be gained from such an investment. This past session, the legislature significantly boosted funding for home visiting, though the portion that was dedicated for matching federal Medicaid funds was vetoed. Next slide. Some of the most beneficial aspects of this process have been gaining a better understanding of exactly what types of evidence-based programs executive agencies are implementing, and as importantly, gaining a better understanding of the cost of poor social outcomes using New Mexico-specific data, which makes this a very powerful tool. For example, inmates released from our corrections department in fiscal year 11 will cost New Mexico taxpayers over $360 million over the next 15 years based on our historical recidivism trends. So we know what that cost is, we know what our experience has been in the past, and we can project that out into the future and figure out how to match up different programs to lower that cost and save taxpayer money and improve outcomes for society. In other cases, we have a better understanding about how much child abuse case resulting in adoption cost taxpayers. It's about $143,000 in New Mexico. How can we safely prevent child abuse or reduce out-of-home placements? We know it costs New Mexico over $133,000 each year to house each juvenile offender in our facilities, and our state, maybe like others, is faced with the decision over building a new juvenile facility. Are there other alternatives? Next slide. Now that the model is fully operational, staff plan to expand how we use this information. We're transitioning into really thinking of results first, not as a cost-benefit model in and of itself, but as an approach to policy and budget development. It's one other tool to help identify what we are getting from government now and how to help policymakers prioritize investments to get better results at a lower cost for taxpayers. As Gary mentioned earlier, just getting a handle on what agencies are actually funding is an important first step. We've been working with our corrections department, for example, just to do that for its community corrections funding. We plan on piloting a consumer-type report unique to New Mexico this summer for our committee in the adult corrections area. Staff will also be incorporating this information into budget and policy analysis work that it does. For example, the state invests large sums of money in drug courts, and our budget analysts will be able to use information from Results First to benchmark the performance of our drug courts versus what's expected based on the research and the cost of our program. This will be important information for the committee to consider as it builds its budget recommendations during the fall. We will continue to reuse Results First in our program evaluations. We are currently assessing the impact of kids' participation in high-quality child care assistance or the federal Head Start program on school readiness, and we'll be able to use New Mexico-specific cost and performance information to assess the relative cost-effectiveness of these two large federal investments. Overall, we feel this partnership has been beneficial and look forward to continue to integrate it in how we do business in New Mexico over time. Thank you and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Charles. As we saw from the presentations from these three states, Results First is enabling policymakers to use evidence in a much more powerful way than they've ever been able to do in the past. And the states are using this to help agencies improve their operations, to get a better handle on how services are being delivered, to strengthen the performance measurement and performance budgeting initiatives by allowing the state to identify and predict what programs should be able to accomplish and compare that to what's actually being delivered for taxpayers. It's also of critical importance in terms of helping policymakers identify what are the best ways of investing taxpayer dollars to maximize the benefits that are being achieved through policymakers using the power of evidence to help us make the best choices we can for our citizens and preserving the value of taxpayer dollars. If you'd like more information about Results First, please contact one of the people that are up on the screen now and shoot us an email. We'd be happy to talk to you about Results First, give you more information on how the work is done in states, and to share more examples of the benefits that states are realizing by working to use evidence in a much more powerful way. We'd be happy to work with you. We are currently in 14 states. Our goal is to bring this to more states over the next year, and we look forward to talking to you and about the possibilities of bringing Results First to your state. We have now about 15 minutes for questions, and we'd be happy to give you more information in response to your specific questions about this work nationwide. I'll turn it back over to Cheryl to manage that process.
Hey, thank you, Gary. We do have one question, and it looks like it's to you or to Pew generally. When you take this WSIPP model to other states, do you use state-specific cost estimates for the societal and taxpayer costs, or is it simply an average cost per crime generated from Washington State or a national average? And then a little bit of an explanatory note, because different states have different business processes. Some take longer than others for making arrests, processing an offender through the system, etc. There could be drastic cost differences in the cost savings resulting from reduced recidivism.
Great question. It is very important to use state-specific information throughout the Results First process, and the implementation process really is about that. It is you gathering the information necessary to predict both the financial and the performance outcomes that would be achieved in a specific state. And to give you an example of this, when we're looking at the cost of crime with the Results First model, we are looking at the total cost of crime within a state. So we're using state-specific information there. It would include, for example, the cost to arrest someone, the cost to prosecute and defend them in the court system, the cost to house them in local jails if they're incarcerated during that time period, and then if they're found guilty, the cost to house them in the state prison system and provide services to them, including post-release supervision once they are released, if they are released. So all that information is based on state-specific information, the information on the cost of serving people in every aspect of that, as well as the cost of the programs that may be delivered to them. So it is all based on state-specific information on both the cost of the programs as well as the people who would be served by these programs. So it involves collecting information on the people in the criminal justice system for the crime portion of the model. We do cohort studies to say, here's what's happening now in the system based on people who are in the criminal justice system. So in the future, if we're able to reduce recidivism through these programs, here's what it actually mean on the ground. Here's the cost of achieving that outcome, and here's the cost benefit of doing so.
Okay, we have another question, and it's a general question as well. How are policymakers and those controlling state budgets educated on the fact that because startup costs are always high when you're implementing a new program, that if a program is not effective, it may not be a good idea to cut the program. It may be more cost-effective to do an in-depth root cause analysis to uncover the problem and fix that, rather than throw the baby out with the bathwater. Especially with treatment programs, research shows that if you maintain a high degree of fidelity to the model, outcomes improve exponentially.
Right, and I think that is a very important point. How Results First is really about helping policymakers understand two things. One is provide them information on what the best programs are based on the national research. And that research shows that some programs are simply much more effective than others because they have been proven by research to produce good effects on the ground. The second thing, and this really gets to the point of the question, is that how well those programs are implemented is also critically important. A good program that is well implemented can produce powerful outcomes for citizens. A good program that is poorly implemented will not achieve those outcomes. So part of the Results First effort in state is to have a lot of communication with policymakers, both to help educate them about what we know about good programs, but also about the importance of fidelity monitoring. And yeah, I would agree that a new program needs to have some time to get up and running. It certainly doesn't happen overnight. But the fidelity part of this in terms of making sure those programs are carefully implemented, that if they're based on national program designs, that those program designs are effectively implemented is of critical importance. Washington State learned the importance of this the hard way. They started investing in functional family therapy when they saw that the cost-benefit analysis that showed it was a cost-effective program. So they invested funds in this for several years. Then the legislature asked the question, which you would hope that legislatures everywhere will ask, which will be, are we getting what we're paying for? Are we getting the predicted outcomes in terms of reducing recidivism for juvenile offenders who are going through this program? So they mandated that a comprehensive evaluation be done to see if the state was achieving that 22% reduction in recidivism that Results First predicted would be accomplished. What they found is that in about half the state, they were getting almost exactly what was predicted, that those programs were producing that reduction in recidivism. Unfortunately, they also found in about the other half of the state, they were getting nowhere near that level of outcomes. And when they looked to find out why, they found out because those programs were not effectively implemented. Those providers were hiring staff that were not properly trained. They were not supervising them. The staff were doing their own thing. And in some cases, those ineffective programs, ineffective because they were badly managed, were making the kids worse. Not only were they not achieving that 22% reduction in recidivism, sometimes, like in Scared Straight, that the kids were more likely to recidivate because they were not receiving effective programs. The legislature reacted the way that it should have. They said, we're not going to pay for ineffective programs. We're not going to allow providers to take our money and to not follow treatment protocol, and they put a very strong quality assurance process in place to ensure that those programs were doing the programs that they were designed to do and to do them well. And when they did that, then they saw another substantial improvement, and recidivism rates went down and the crime rate went down. So it is very important, and it is part of what we do with states, is to communicate that evidence shows that there are good programs out there, but you'll only achieve those outcomes if programs are effectively monitored, and fidelity is critically important, and it needs to be part of an evidence-based approach to policymaking.
Okay, we have a brief follow-up question to the answer you just gave. Aggression replacement training for juveniles is shown to be cost-effective. How does your model account for those programs that have fidelity to the model and those that don't? We know that this has a tremendous impact on whether a program is, quote, effective, end quote.
Mm-hmm. In working with states, there is both the assessment, as several of the states mentioned, of what programs is the state currently operating, and what percentage of those programs are evidence-based. And then for the ones that are evidence-based, an assessment of, are those programs being implemented with fidelity? And that is one of the things that we work with states on. Because again, fidelity is critically important. We want states to be able to assess whether their programs are well implemented, and if they are, then the model can provide very detailed predictions of what effectiveness those programs will have on the ground for the citizens of the state. So it is something that is a critical part of our approach, and it's a critical part of the discussions with policymakers.
All right. That was the last question that we had. So would anybody like to say anything in closing?
From the Pew-MacArthur team, I'd just like to reiterate again that if you have questions about this, please let us know, and we'd be happy to talk with you and come to your state and explore whether this is an approach would be appropriate for your state policymakers to consider. I welcome the opportunity for Brian and Michael and Charles to make some statements as well.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have a quick question that did just pop up for Charles. It says, Charles says he has a team of evaluators and a team of economists working on this project. How large are these teams, and were they new hires or existing staff?
Yes. Just within our office, we have a team of program evaluators. They're not all specific to the Results First initiative, but we do house the legislative program evaluation function within the LFC. And the LFC also does have a team of economists that work on the revenue estimates. But we tend to vary when we use the model. I only have one person that's actually been inputting the data and working with executive agencies, and they were already hired before we started this process, so there weren't any extra startup costs.
Brian and Mike, would you like to talk about how large your teams are?
Sure. Brian Dickerson, I'll speak first on that. We have a team of currently 3 working on this, and that's myself with Peer, and Brian Pew, who is the budget analyst for the Legislative Budget Office, and Ben Collins, who is with our Mississippi Reapportionment Committee. We brought him in specifically to work with the large-scale data sets that the model requires. He just knows how to manipulate the data a little bit better to get it to us faster. Brian Pew is handling the cost aspects of this, and I'm mainly focusing on coordinating the entire project and working with the program inventories. And also, to complement what was said earlier, we also had everybody on staff early and have not had to hire any positions to help with this model.
Mike?
Yeah, over here in Massachusetts, I oversee the overall project and lead the team involved in ascertaining marginal costs for all the activities within our system here in Massachusetts. We have another person heading up the program inventory assessment within our research and planning division. And then there's a team of about 7 researchers, a real community of folks that work at either probation, the Sentencing Commission, the DOC, parole, DYS, that have biweekly calls to do and complete the recidivism analysis outcome and resource use outcome. And that's been a great team. And they have like a weekly call for about an hour, and they do some work in between those calls to finalize the analysis. So we have a good, solid team. None of these folks were hired. It takes a lot of commitment from the state, and once we've committed, folks have really dedicated themselves. They really believe in the work.
Great. Well, thank you. And I think that shows that it doesn't take an army to do this, but it does take staff who are committed to this. It takes leadership support to marshal the staff time necessary to do this, but it is something that a growing number of states are doing. I'd like to close by thanking Brian and Michael and Charles for participating in this. I'd like to thank CSG and Jennifer for putting this together and for your continued good work, both for the states that you represent as well as the citizens. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and I look forward to the opportunity of continuing the conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Gary, and thank you for pulling this together. It was a lot of really great information, and I hope anybody that has any questions will get in contact with you, or you can contact me. This webinar has been recorded, and it will be available online on CSG's website within the next 48 hours. So check in at csg.org. And this information will be up there, and you can get a hold of Gary through me or through the addresses that are on the screen right now. So, all right. Well, thank you everybody, and have a pleasant afternoon.